Hey everyone, my name is Lizzie, and today we'll be talking about mold, bacteria, infections in your homebrew. So let's start with infections, because if you see some, it's a cause of concern. So infections are when wild yeast compete with cultured yeast for sugar. So I had to ask myself, what is wild yeast and what is cultured yeast? So wild yeast is the yeast that you can find in the air, on top of fruits, you can find it anywhere. It's from the environment, and some people try to catch this wild yeast, and you usually find them in places with good aromas. Versus cultured yeast, which are the yeast in sachets. So it could be the EC 1118, it could be the bread yeast, any yeast that you could buy from Amazon or from the grocery store. If you'd like any yeast suggestions, you can look in the description below. There are a few links of yeast that you can purchase. So when your alcohol is infected, it tastes sour, it tastes buttery, and personally, I've never had these flavors. I even heard it tasting like cabbage or sewage. That's disgusting. So how does that happen? It happens when your equipment is not sanitized properly. And what a lot of homebrewers recommend, or alcohol makers, is to use Star San and to just wipe your equipment to disinfect it. I would pour hot water in it, just not boiling, because the boiling water once cracked my fermenting jar, so I'm done with that. But just make sure that everything is washed in between your different uses. So now let's talk about the mold. Mold versus bacteria. A lot of people confuse the two, but mold is larger. That's why we can see it with our naked eyes. And a bacteria is smaller and less complex. Mold actually is like yeast in the sense that they're both fungus and they grow only in the presence of oxygen. So when we do open fermentation, this is when you leave the yeast open in the air for the first 1 to 3 days, you're in danger of having mold in your alcohol. So this is a risk when you do open fermentation because your yeast initially is exposed to oxygen for the first 3 days. Although yeast and mold are both in the category of fungus, they have their differences. So yeast cells are individuals. They just take care of themselves. They just want to eat, be happy, eat their sugar. They want to make themselves survive. They only take care of themselves. They're like selfish creatures, and they even eat dead yeast cells to continue living. Versus molds. Molds are like a community. So they merge together and they share nutrients, energy, and waste. And many molds, just like yeast, produce toxins, which are biological products with poisonous effects. However, most toxins or bacteria are destroyed with alcohol or boiling water. Toxins can also be reduced with refrigeration as well. So just be careful with boiling water when it comes to glass or plastic, because you want to remove the bacteria, but you want to make sure that your equipment is in good standing. So what do you do when there's mold inside your beer, inside your cider, inside your wine? Basically, you have two options. You either scrape it off or you throw the whole batch. And let me know in the comments below, what do you do? If you've ever had mold in your home brew, do you do the former or the latter? Are you one of those people who, after their long and hard work, you don't want to throw it away? Or are you more on the safe side? As soon as you see mold, you tell yourselves, no, I would never drink this, and just throw the whole thing out and go on to the next batch. For those who haven't had mold in their home brew, I just wanted to let you know what it looks like. It can be green, white, or brown, but what they have in common is that it's fuzzy. It has this fuzzy texture. However, in your alcohol, you do not necessarily have mold, but it could be infected. And for it to be infected, you can have these sort of white bubbles on top of your fermenting jar that do not pop. And this is called pellicle. And this only grows on the surface of your alcohol because the bacteria doesn't survive the alcohol itself. So honestly, I know that some people are really reluctant into throwing their batch, but when the infection affects the taste of your alcohol, it's time to throw it out. I mean, at some point, sour or cabbage or sewage alcohol is not very enjoyable. So when it comes to mold, it's created in humid conditions and at a temperature of 15 degrees Celsius or 16 degrees Fahrenheit. So these are perfect homebrewing conditions, meaning that your alcohol might be susceptible to mold. Also, if you add chopped fruits to your fermentation, mold grows on fruits, so you just want to make sure that you be careful with that. And those fruits stay at the top of the jar, they float, and they're more exposed to oxygen. So you just want to be careful when you add fruits that they do not have mold at the beginning, middle, or end of your fermentation process. However, there's good news. There's a way of preventing and managing mold. So if we go back to the fruits, what you can do is to dump the fruits inside the jar regularly, so they'll be covered with alcohol, and mold or bacteria have a harder time thriving in alcoholic environments. And you want to make sure that there's as little oxygen as possible in your fermenting jar. So you want to make sure that the lid is screwed on tightly, your airlock is tight, and that the bulk of the fermentation happens without oxygen. And if it's a lost cause, if there's too much bacteria or it's too infected and you dump it out, just make sure that you're dumping it out because it's mold and not yeast, because yeast can also be floating within the jar, but the difference is the color. And the yeast can be on top of the jar as well. But the difference between the yeast and pellicle is that pellicle, personally, I've never had it, but from what I've seen is that the bubbles do not pop. But yeast bubbles, they do. So it's a thin line. If ever you're in doubt, you can always taste your alcohol to see if it tastes good or bad. But usually when it's infected, it looks different. It's not as cute. And when it comes to bottling, what you can also do if there's infection, if there's mold at the top, you can siphon the bottom part of your alcohol, siphon it, and leave the top layer of mold and throw it out. But in this case, you have to make sure that you don't siphon all the yeast that's sunk to the bottom of the jar. So you have to siphon the middle part and not get the bottom part of the yeast and the top part that's infected. So this can be a little tricky, but if you really want to save your batch, that's what you can do. But in order really to prevent this, I would just suggest to sanitize your equipment, and I have a video on that. You can watch it here. And if you found this video valuable, don't forget to share it with a friend, like and subscribe. I'll see you in the next one.